If you want. All right, welcome everybody. Um, all right. Everybody that came in person, thank you for coming. It's pretty cool to see a little group of people focused on the same thing. Ultimately, peer-to-peer networks kind of replicate real life where, your community, people you know, people you exchange with, kind of create the basis for everything in your life, right? Uh, and that's one of the really interesting things about decentralized systems is that on one hand you have like technical parameters, but on the other hand you have a social system. And kind of like any social system, you have various levels of like trust. Sometimes you could call that belief. And in the extreme, I would even say it's healthy to have an element of faith, right, in each other, people in your networks. Now, that is both something that uh, can offer a lot of benefits, right? It can allow you entry into a peer-to-peer system, but it's also something that is an attack vector, right? If you have people that kind of exploit your trust or your belief or your emotions, that doesn't always end well. I had a presentation put together to kind of cover the basis of Ergo itself. And then I was thinking last night, everybody here anyway, and many people that are probably tuning in already know these things, right? So what is the point of just repeating, um, I don't know, what's publicly available, and anybody with some time, energy, or desire can easily read. Now I know that's somewhat of a skill that's being lost, is the ability to read, but it's there, right? I do think it's fascinating, kind of the events of yesterday, right? So let's just speak to the moment. Yesterday, I was out having some beer and some food with some of the people that showed up completely oblivious to, the workings of kind of the broader crypto ecosystem. And you come back and they're like, oh, there's been a spiral effect of deleveraging and billions have been removed from the market and what's happening and all these people I don't know, hopefully manage their risk, right? A good starting point is understanding like risk management and leverage. Leverage is a powerful tool when it's needed, right? But it's also risky. It's not without its trade-offs. And I think that sometimes you have the talking heads in the crypto industry that do not like to talk about risk. And I think that's a fundamental failure of the cryptocurrency ecosystem broadly, because ultimately in our world, money is a control system, right? We live, let's say, within the United States. You have a group of people on a hill somewhere, they say, right? And they go into a room and they discuss in private. Okay, publicly they'll say we have two parameters. We want to have employment at a certain level. We want to have inflation at a certain level. And those two don't necessarily correlate in terms of how they move anyway, right? But they go into a room in secret and everybody around the world gathers and watches. Say, what are they going to do with our money, right? What is going to be the cost of money? And we sit around and speculate, and sometimes people have fun on Polymarket or whatever. And eventually, smoke comes out of the chimney, and we say, okay, this is our new updated policy, right? We've forked the network, so to speak, and this is going to be the cost of money. And we go through this ritual, regularly. People around the world tune in and watch and position and try to um, kind of front run whatever that trusted setup is going to be. And then on a higher level, we have this idea of, um, let's call it the type of cross-chain tariff, right? Where arbitrarily you have new costs added to the system. That's, I guess, what was a part of the madness yesterday, more or less. Let's see. Where suddenly, you have these two economies that interact, and we're going to add 100% tariff, right? And there's no real consensus mechanism to understand what is coming, right? It's a trusted system where the individual has very little power. They have very little power in terms of understanding what the assumption is today and what the assumptions are going to be tomorrow. And that's not the type of environment that produces, I don't know, the right mindset for risk itself, right? And that's one of the most interesting things about this idea that started with Bitcoin is saying, okay, can we have a system where the parameters are set, right? Where monetary policy is more or less set, and then build economy on top of set expectations. And based on how the network is set up, within a certain set of assumptions, you can assume honesty. That's powerful. If you look at kind of the traditional system um, that we're all born into, and it's something we just naturally inherit. It changes depending on where you're from, right? But it's kind of more or less the same system where you have a high concentration of power, and then, of course, one of the most profitable things is to be close to power, right? Close to where money is being distributed from. And generally, the further away you get from that initial distribution point of money, the more inflation and expansion of money supply tends to hit, right? I would say a lot of the crypto has industry has really gotten away from first principles. And in my opinion, that's based on toxic social systems, right? Because that social system is inherent uh, to these type of networks, right? Where you constantly have people that are saying, trust me, believe in me, have faith in me. Um, and I think that is not the ideal environment to create the systems that we want to build, right? It's a part of why, at least with Ergo, I've always tried to push for build in public. That we should ideally have these primitives in place that are the equivalent of public goods. They're open, they're auditable, and hopefully through time and with testing, they also become extended, right? They become extendable. You could look at something within the Ergo network like SigmaUSD, right? You have first, it's based on research, right? It's not something that is just willy-nilly thrown together, which we do see a lot of that in the space, right? So as an experiment, it has a solid foundation, right? Then you have kind of open code, open parameters around that experiment. That even if the experiment itself experiences difficulty, you have the ability to extend it, adjust it. It's open, right? It's open to new ideas, it's open to new iteration. And ultimately, through time, I think we can build solid public goods with that framework. And my hope would be that creates its own flywheel effect, right? Everybody in crypto these days will talk about, oh, the flywheel, right? In terms of, you know, financial games, right? The ideal, in my opinion, is to create flywheels with software to where you have these public goods that can then be reused, right? And the more diverse these building blocks come, you can suddenly cater to a larger class of functions and applications and build something that has a solid foundation. Sometimes we get away from this idea of open code. And I think that type of transparency should be a solid base for a healthy social system because it's based in trust, right? Not faith. We are a proof of work network, and proof of work, one of the interesting things is a coordination mechanism is it's leaderless. It's apolitical, right? And that's something that people often struggle with, like grasping in terms of the social system. They'll say, "Hey, Armenio, you need to, go dance over here, go do over there. You're, supposed to be a leader." And it's like, well, I have a certain set of skills, right? But meeting everybody that attended, and I'm sure everybody watching, you have a different set of skills. No different than in the off-chain peer-to-peer economy, you bring different skill sets, different abilities, different specialties that you've developed through time in your life, and you create value using those. I don't think there should be that much difference. Like I'm not universally uh, intelligent enough to be the leader of everything, right? I have my areas where I would say I've, learned and grown and developed a certain skill set, but in other areas, you do not want me in charge, right? I'm not the guy. And people struggle with that because in social systems, a lot of the competition is to be the guy, right? If certainly if I have people's trust and belief and faith and they follow me, um, I guess that's an attack vector that we see all the time in crypto. And it's funny how, the sheep are taught their entire life to fear the wolf, and then in the end, the shepherd eats them, right? So having that um, basis of how do we create trustlessness, not just in software, but also in the social system itself, that takes responsibility. It takes a collective responsibility, right? We're going to build things the right way. And at least in extended UTXO, there is a trilemma, let's call it. You have the contract itself, you have the off-chain logic, you have the front end, right? In the ideal scenario, all three of those can be replicated locally. That's what I would say makes for a decentralized application. That's pretty clear parameters, right? So as an ecosystem, I think it's healthy to really push for that. That's something that I've always tried to promote. And it's hard to build open code, right? Because you are, in essence, being naked in public. It is sometimes a process to get there, right? But I think that is ultimately a solid goal in terms of building public goods. So we hear about this trilemma in blockchain all the time. You usually have it's a selling point, for lack of a better term. It's a selling point. But I do think that within the Ergo ecosystem, anyway, I would like to promote the idea of our own little trilemma, which are those three aspects of an application. And ideally, if you have those three aspects that are open, and you have tooling that becomes kind of a common knowledge base for developers to use and build off of, you have things in place to start creating the right flywheel. That's kind of hard to bootstrap from nothing, but I think we've done a pretty good job as a whole of creating that mindset and mind share. And there have been a lot of developers, some of which are here, some of which choose to remain faceless, which I totally respect, that have contributed to that type of mindset. And so, everybody that's contributed to that ideal public goods, I kind of have to tip my hat to you. That's ultimately powerful when it comes to not just the network itself, but also the social system um, of the network. Now, from first principles, crypto should be about, the distribution of power. Proof of work kind of represents that in terms of the distribution mechanism of money itself, right? It's something that you can certainly compete for and build into, but having clear assumptions in terms of distribution of power is needed. And sometimes that is buried behind really good marketing. Sometimes that's buried behind social systems. Sometimes it's buried behind this trust me, bro mentality that permeates the crypto industry. And I think that's toxic. And I don't really care if people uh, don't like that, right? Because if you can't call a spade a spade, your social system's not going to work, right? That's just honest. I know there's a lot of financial games and cultural movements and things like that. I've said from day one, for me personally, I would rather go to a casino. I know the drinks are free, right? That's a solid assumption that I can bank on every time. And, whatever my parameters of risk are with the games that I play, at least I know that assumption's going to hold. Um, Now, security is another powerful mechanism of, uh, both the network parameters and kind of this social layer, because we do need to address both, right? Sometimes we see them as separate and they're extensions of each other, in terms of what people accept. Um, Security is, at least in our industry, is something that's formed through time, right? You usually have research as, the bedrock of computer science. Then on top of research, you have implementations, right? Where people will try to take research and use engineering skills to convert that into something that's tangible. And then you have the test of time, which kind of is the ultimate teacher in life. Um, so having things that are built on a solid foundation and are introduced and kind of go through this test of hardening through time ultimately should be a goal. That doesn't mean you can't innovate, right? It doesn't mean you can't extend. It doesn't mean you can't provide research. Certainly in Ergo, we have led in various areas of implementing things that kind of came from the academic sphere. But I think there's an element of wisdom in being conservative, right? And sometimes uh, that is not the focus of the crypto space, right? Innovation is wonderful, but I would also say that sometimes iteration is innovation, right? Where you take something, you extend it. It holds, you extend it. It holds, you extend it, rather than, trying to reinvent the wheel for the 700th time. And, it's good for marketing. It's not necessarily good for security, right? Because you have a weird curve distribution where through time, usually you have the research side, right? And like the engineering complexity, let's say is much higher. And then through time, as it becomes more of a standard, it becomes easier to adopt. There's better tools. Like that whole process of evolution is not something that you can cheat very effectively. It's something that is much slower than the hype cycles that people are taught, right? So I want everyone to remember when it comes to security that time is ultimately the test. We can look at kind of the first principle of privacy, which is probably fundamentally one of the most important things we need to explore, right? Um, there is some potential future where the children, uh, people in this room have, could grow up into a world where every economic transaction they touch is audited, stored, and you could watch every penny that someone has touched throughout the course of their life. That type of control system is getting to the point where it's technically possible, and that should frighten the hell out of everybody, right? That type of system, I do believe there are some powers in this world. That's where they would like to take humanity, right? Because it certainly offers them, um, well, greater power and control. And so I think having the ability to remain private, anonymous, have your personal space, um, is going to be one of the most fundamentally important things that we need to work to protect as an industry, right? And that doesn't just mean we're going to add zero knowledge proofs to everything and have more control systems in place. I think that's a bit of a perversion from privacy itself, right? That's a trade-off that many people see as quite sexy, right? Where we're going to have ZK compliance, and if you just get more and more and more and more ZK compliance, you have a stronger control system. So I think we need to really look at this idea of privacy, make that an absolute, chase that on multiple layers of networks rather than have it be toy. Because I would say in some cases, yes, it does offer like visibility assistance in terms of people not seeing your transactions or what's happening, but um, in terms of the broader assumption, it's toy privacy, it's not real. And I think we need to be very clear in terms of what our set of assumptions are long term with privacy and what the goals are with privacy. Because there are a lot of projects, there's a lot of research um, beyond Ergo itself that is valuable in terms of preserving privacy, preserving anonymity. I think that ultimately should be one of the most important tenets of creating censorship resistant systems and censorship resistant money. Um, the other area has to do with inclusion, right? We are seeing a mix in the space where it comes to regulated assets, non-regulated assets, bearer assets, non-bearer assets. And that needs to be something that there's a lot of clarity with, because not everything in crypto is the same. I know that in the social layer, there's, everything is a ticker with some letters in it, right? But the underlying assumptions that you need to make in terms of, custodial, non-custodial, is this a bearer asset? Is this not a bearer asset? Is probably going to get even more complex when we start seeing regulated assets appearing, right? We've kind of seen some of this freeze and seize with stable coins, but the crypto industry is changing, right? Even yesterday or 2 days ago, there's an announcement that, these 10 major banks are going to collaborate and create some, stablecoin instruments. Oddly enough, they tend to be the same banks that own the corporation that's on the hill, but that's a side, uh, that's a side journey that, not probably not the rabbit hole for right now. But that type of assumption of inclusion is going to get really important. Um, I do know that Alex Kushti, as many call him, has been working on a whitelist mechanism, which I think is probably the better way to deal with like uncertainty in terms of power. Where, rather than you join and you might get blacklisted at any time for any reason, you make a voluntary agreement. And hopefully there's clear assumptions in that agreement in terms of the risks that you're inheriting in doing that, right? This last is probably this element of resilience, right? And ultimately, I think that's why open source code is so important, because good ideas are hard to kill, right? I do hope not just within Ergo, but within various aspects of the cryptocurrency space and some of the privacy space that's been around, we're able to develop tools that ultimately develop into truly resilient systems. I've operated under the belief that over the long arc of time, the only thing of value in cryptocurrency really is state resistance. Everything else will probably, in my opinion, distill down to the common denominator underneath, which is centralization, right? Because if you're not shooting for state resistance, ultimately the most efficient thing is going to prevail through time, and the most efficient thing will be centralized. Now, maybe it'll be pseudo-centralized. We can have a debate whether Amazon Web Services is distributed, decentralized, because you have data centers all over the place that optimize, um, speed. But I would say that in terms of power distribution, we have to be honest and say, okay, it is distributed, but the actual concentration of power there is pretty apparent. So over time, if we build on first principles, I do believe that the crypto space is capable of developing open source tools for coordinating capital and creating systems where within a certain set of assumptions, we can assume honesty, right? And luckily, at least with Ergo, we have this proof of work mechanism that has a pretty well time tested mechanism of, what are your assumptions of honesty? What are your attack vectors? In terms of the contractual layer that we've come up with, it is relatively conservative. So I think those are solid building blocks towards a larger goal. Sometimes within the social layer of crypto, you sign on to Twix, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, and you listen to the, uh, I don't know, commentary, the talking heads. It does kind of leave you wondering, what the hell are we doing, right? Why are we here? And I think that ultimately should be the most important aspect, is we need to have clear intent and clear purpose. Because if you don't have clear intent and clear purpose, you're not going to be grounded in what you do, right? And crypto as a whole, I would say, needs to be more grounded, right? I do hope that over time, we create a tool set that's diverse enough, and again, in extended UTXO, that's going to be contractual, it's going to be off-chain, it's going to be front-end wise. We create enough tools around those three problem areas, the trilemma, let's say, that we can serve a diverse set of needs. And I think sometimes uh, marketing and kind of just social spam buries that intent, right? So my hope in going through all of the presentations that we've set up, all of the speakers, everybody here is doing really unique things that are targeted, that improve like the assumptions, that offer new tools, and understanding that as a piece that can be replicated within a whole, uh, over time, I believe will lead to a broader tool set that's powerful. And I think we've done a pretty good job as an ecosystem, developing open public goods, sets of tools that um, have led to some interesting things. We just went through a major upgrade with Sigma 6 new node version, right? And that will open the door to a lot of new capacity. And I hope that as we kind of build to enhance new system capacities, we stay focused in on mission, because that type of purpose, I think, is important. It's not just important for like solid programming beyond the network. It's important for the social system. And the social system in crypto is very toxic. It's just honest. I sometimes have said, my favorite thing is seeing all of these tools that enhance individual like power, takes responsibility. My least favorite thing in crypto is people that look for a savior, right? Because that's not really how peer-to-peer networks work. That's the client-server relationship, my friends. So if we get back to this idea of saying, okay, how can we distribute power across peers and empower peers to have tooling, to have access, to have software that ultimately can serve them and their needs, that's the ideal for cryptocurrency. I would say everything else is just digital money. And I think we need to kind of lean into that because, you know, uh, the possibilities if, privacy does not work as an industry, if resilience doesn't work uh, as an industry, the trade-offs are huge in terms of the world long term, that could be spun up around us. And, sometimes I wonder what kind of world my children will live in, right? Like what will I can see myself. I was born into this strange system. You got the people on the hill, you've got, this distribution of power that I can't really touch or interact with much. But what about the future? How much stronger could that get theoretically? And that should scare the shit out of everybody, in all honesty. So for me, I think that kind of sums up the purpose, the intent of why I'm here, right? It's the only thing that matters. So I do hope that as an industry, it's something that, we can mature around, look at all of the trade-offs of control in different areas and build wisely. So I'm gonna kick it off to MG Pi and Luca. I need to set up their mics, set up their presentation, uh, get them ready to go. But thank you everybody for tuning in and enjoy.